The coffee in the conference room on the 34th floor of Aldridge and Hartman had been sitting in its carafe since 7 that morning, and by noon it smelled like burnt ambition, bitter, institutional, and somehow completely honest. Ethan Cole did not drink it. He sat at the far end of a table long enough to seat 16 and watched the door with the quiet patience of a man who had learned, over the course of approximately 2 years, to stop measuring time by what other people were doing with it. The folder in front of him was thin. That was the point. Everything he had built over the past 14 months had been compressed, distilled, and organized into a document that was 43 pages long and contained within it the precise, documented, legally defensible end of Dominic Ashford's professional existence. Ethan had not slept the night before. Not from anxiety. He had stayed awake because the numbers in his head kept rearranging themselves into new formations, and he had wanted to sit with the final picture before he handed it over. To hold it in his own mind for one last night. Private and complete and entirely his own, before it became something that belonged to courts and agencies and federal investigators and the machinery of consequence. Richard Hartman came in at 12:03 without knocking. He was 61 years old, wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and had spent 40 years in corporate litigation developing a face that revealed nothing to opposing counsel and only slightly more to the people on his own side. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the folder. "Is it clean?" he asked. "It's clean," Ethan said. Hartman sat down. He picked up the folder and opened it with the same careful motion a surgeon might use opening a chest cavity. Deliberate, unhurried, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. Ethan watched the December light come through the floor to ceiling, windows, and fall across the carpet in pale parallelograms, moving almost imperceptibly as the clouds outside shifted. "The shell companies," Hartman said without looking up. "All 14 of them," Ethan said. "Delaware LLCs, most registered within 30 days of each corresponding HUD project approval. The registered agents are all the same man, a paralegal in Hoboken who signed documents for $800 a month and, I would estimate, had no meaningful understanding of what he was facilitating. Meaning he'll cooperate. Meaning he already has. He gave a voluntary statement to the DOJ's Civil Division 3 weeks ago. I wasn't in the room, but I've read a summary of his account. He's going to be a cooperative witness." Hartman turned a page. His expression did not change, but something in the set of his shoulders did. A fractional settling, the physical language of a man whose assessment is being confirmed. "The appraisals. Inflated by an average of 31% across the 7 projects I was able to fully document. The appraiser, a licensed MAI appraiser in New Jersey named Gerald Kwan, produced reports based on comparable sales data that either didn't exist or had been selectively cherry-picked to support predetermined valuations that the developer needed to justify the mortgage amounts he was seeking. Kwan has a history. 2 prior complaints filed with the Appraisal Institute, both dismissed for insufficient evidence. He won't be so fortunate this time." Hartman set down the folder. He looked at Ethan the way experienced men look at other men who have just shown them something that exceeded their expectations. Not with warmth exactly, but with the particular form of respect that has nothing performative in it. It was a look Ethan had learned to recognize in the past 3 years. It felt nothing like what he used to imagine recognition would feel like. It felt cleaner than that, more useful. "The qui tam," Hartman said, "filed under seal 8 weeks ago. The Civil Division has been reviewing. Based on the timeline and what I've been able to understand through appropriate channels, the government will move to intervene within the next 10 days. When they do, it becomes public. Yes, Hartman folded his hands on the table. You understand that when this becomes public, Ashford's name will be attached to a federal fraud allegation that encompasses 7 projects and 8 or 9 years of documented conduct. His financing dries up overnight. His institutional partnerships unwind. His active developments go into receivership, and the lenders on his completed projects will begin reviewing their exposure. I understand that, Ethan said, and you're comfortable with that outcome. Ethan picked up his pen, the one that had been running dry since early November and that he had kept using anyway because he had started something with it and did not see the logic in switching, and set it back down. Mr. Hartman, I was retained to conduct a forensic examination of Ashford Properties' financial records in connection with your client's civil complaint against the entity. I found what I found. The qui tam is a separate filing, made under my own authority as a private citizen who discovered evidence of fraud against the federal government while conducting that legitimately authorized engagement. I brought it to the appropriate venue. What happens after the government intervenes is not something I caused. It's something Dominic Ashford caused, starting in 2019 when he filed the first false cost certification with HUD and signed his name to numbers he knew were invented. Hartman was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not absence of thought, but the opposite. I'm going to recommend you to 3 firms, he said. Thank you, Ethan said. He picked up his briefcase. The 43 pages stayed on the table. He had a copy secured on an encrypted drive in the inner pocket of his coat, and another copy held at his attorney's office, and a third in the fire safe in his storage unit, because he had learned that the things you build carefully should exist in more than one place, and that the people who try to destroy inconvenient documents always underestimate how many places those documents can live. He took the elevator down alone. The lobby smelled like cleaned stone and recycled air and the faint ghost of someone's cologne, something expensive and slightly too heavy for an enclosed space, the kind of scent a man applies when he is still in the process of deciding who he wants to be understood as. Ethan walked through it without breaking stride and came out onto 6th Avenue into a December that had not yet committed to snow, but had committed firmly to the idea of it. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked across the street at nothing in particular. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment that a federal asset freeze would make inaccessible. Within the month, Mara Sinclair was probably having lunch with someone, in the manner of a woman who had not yet understood the specific shape of what was coming. He thought about that for exactly as long as it deserved. Then he turned north and walked. 18 months earlier, Ethan Cole had been the kind of man that other men described as solid. It was not a compliment. It was the verbal equivalent of a shrug. An acknowledgement that nothing was visibly wrong, paired with the unspoken implication that nothing was particularly remarkable either. He knew this because he had heard it said about himself at a rooftop party in late May by a woman he had been dating for 2 years, 11 months, and 17 days. He had not been supposed to hear it. The party was on the roof of a building in Tribeca, one of those events that existed primarily to be photographed, where the lighting had been engineered to make everyone look as though they had been born into money they hadn't actually worked for, and the music was curated to suggest that everyone present was, at this exact moment, living their most interesting life. Claire Devereaux had turned 32 that weekend and had chosen to celebrate the way she celebrated everything. Loudly, publicly, and with a dress that cost more than Ethan's first car. He had been there because Mara was there. He had come up from the bathroom, still pressing his way through the cluster of people gathered near the bar, when he heard his name. Not his name exactly. He heard Ethan. And then Claire's voice, doing the thing it always did, dropping half a register into that particular carrying intimacy that conveyed 3 times further than a normal speaking voice, saying, "Look, he's fine, he's sweet, but he's not enough." He stopped. He was standing behind a column wrapped in Edison lights, holding a glass of sparkling water he hadn't yet taken a sip from, and the music was low and jazzy and completely inadequate as cover for what was being said 4 feet away from him. Not enough how? That was a voice he did not recognize at first, and then placed as Jade, who worked in fashion PR and had opinions about everything, and the attention span to pursue none of them for longer than a season. Every way, Mara's voice. Quiet. Not cruel, exactly. The kind of honest that emerges when people believe they are genuinely in private, unguarded, unperformed, just the actual opinion running without its usual social filter. He's an accountant. He's going to be an accountant. He goes to bed at 10:30. He drives a 4-year-old Acura. He's the most predictable man I have ever been with, and I don't know why it took me this long to be honest with myself about it. "So break up with him," Claire said, with the casual certainty of a woman who had never experienced the friction of attachment. "I know, I will." A pause. The sound of something being set down on a surface. Glass on glass. "I keep waiting for him to surprise me, and he never does. That's the thing about Ethan. He never once surprises me." Ethan stood behind the column and felt the specific quality of silence that lives inside a moment you know will not leave you. Not the silence of the city. The city was making its usual background sounds, the low mechanical hum that ran beneath everything, like a frequency no one had chosen to notice, but a silence that was his alone. Internal. The kind that occurred when the background music of a life cut out mid-song and left you standing in the space where it had been, holding the sudden bare understanding that you had been hearing it wrong for a long time. He did not move for perhaps 30 seconds. He counted his own breathing. Then he straightened his back, walked to the bar, and set down the sparkling water he had not touched. He ordered a scotch, neat. He drank it slowly, with the deliberateness of a man filing information, not drowning it. He went and found Mara, who was across the roof now in a different conversation, and he stood beside her and put his hand on the small of her back, as he had done 1,000 times. And she leaned against him and smiled up at him. And he smiled back. That night, in the Acura on the way back downtown, he understood several things simultaneously. The first was that she was not wrong about the facts. He drove a 4-year-old Acura. He did go to bed at 10:30 most nights, because 10:30 was when the thinking he did during the day had run its course, and the rest was diminishing returns. He was, by the metrics her particular social world used to evaluate a man, insufficient. The second was that the metrics her social world used to evaluate a man were roughly as reliable and meaningful as a compass calibrated to a magnet inside its own case. Measuring something, technically, but not what they claimed to measure. The third thing was the one that settled into his chest with a particular cold weight. Not the weight of grief, though there was some of that, because he was not without human feeling, and the recognition that the woman you have been building a life with has been discussing your inadequacies with her friends while you held her coffee order and remembered her mother's birthday is not a thing that lands without weight. But beneath the grief, and outlasting it almost immediately, was something more durable. A decision, not yet formed into specific action, but present as an intention. The intention of a man who has just had something made visible that he had been too close to see. He was not going to say anything. Not that night. Not for a while. Because there was something he needed to understand first. And understanding it would require that Mara and her friends believe that nothing had changed between the rooftop and whatever came next. He was still the solid, predictable, 4 years behind the trend Ethan Cole. He had just started watching differently. They had met at a work event. One of those cross-industry networking evenings at a hotel in Midtown, where the canapes were always slightly cold, and the conversations were always slightly warm, and everyone was in the process of deciding whether the person in front of them was worth the investment of their actual attention. He had been 29. She had been 27. She worked for a boutique event management firm that organized corporate functions for financial services companies, which was how she came to be at an event that Ethan's firm had co-sponsored. She had a quality he had noticed immediately and spent some time later trying to name. A social precision. The way she worked a room was not aggressive or performative, it was surgical. She identified the useful people. She asked the exactly right questions and listened with the quality of attention that people reserve for conversations they have decided matter. She left at exactly the moment those conversations peaked, before the descent into redundancy. He had watched her do this 3 times from across the room before she came and talked to him, and when she did, he had the slightly unnerving sensation of being evaluated by someone who was good at it. He hadn't minded. He had been used to evaluation. Forensic accounting, even then, 3 years into his transition from corporate audit, meant you spent your days building the habit of looking past what numbers claimed to say toward what they were structured to conceal. He looked at people the same way. He looked at Mara and saw a woman who was skilled, motivated, and socially intelligent in ways that her current professional context was not yet giving her full room to deploy. He saw someone who was still in the early chapters of deciding what she wanted her life to look like and who was gathering information about her options with the focused efficiency of someone who intended to make a good choice. He had thought, with a confidence that he now recognized as the particular confidence of a person who has not yet understood what they are measuring, that he might be good for her. He was, for a time, in the ways that mattered to him. Steady, present, consistent. He paid attention to what she told him and held it precisely. The details about her difficult relationship with her mother, the specific ambition she had about starting her own firm one day, the way certain kinds of crowds exhausted her, even as she navigated them flawlessly. He showed up. He repaired things in her apartment that needed repairing. He was the person she called at 11:30 on a work night, when a client had threatened to pull out of a major event with 36 hours' notice, and she needed someone to talk her through the logistics of a contingency. He had been good at all of that. The problem, and he could see it now with a resolution the previous 3 years had not offered him, was that she had not wanted to be stabilized. She had wanted to be elevated. Stability and elevation were not the same thing, and the gap between them was exactly the length of the distance between who Ethan was and who Dominic Ashford was. She had not been wrong to notice that gap. She had been wrong about what the gap meant, about which side of it was pointing up. He understood this clearly for the first time on the elevator ride down from Claire's rooftop, in the 30 seconds between the 16th floor and the lobby. and then it sat in him, clarifying. He had learned Dominic Ashford's name 7 weeks after the rooftop party, which was 4 weeks after Mara had finally said, in her own apartment on a Tuesday evening in early July, the thing she had apparently been rehearsing for considerably longer than he had understood. She had made tea. That detail had struck him, the ritual of tea, which was a gesture of warmth and care in service of an ending. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in the West Village, narrow and 1-bedroom and so accumulative in the way of spaces that had never been committed to as permanent. The furniture didn't match in the way of intention. It matched the way furniture matches when you buy things as you need them and never go back to reconsider the whole. The walls were still largely bare. She had always said she'd get around to decorating. He had learned, eventually, that the things she said she'd get around to were the things she had already decided, somewhere beneath the layer of conscious intention, were temporary. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said. He was sitting on her couch. She was sitting across from him on the edge of her armchair, the mug in both hands, her posture arranged into something that was a careful balance between open and defended. "I can tell," he said. "I don't think we want the same things." This was the polite architecture of the thing. He had already heard the unpolished version through the ambient noise of a Tribeca rooftop. He said nothing. He had discovered over the past 7 weeks that silence was a tool he had been underusing for most of his adult life. "I think I've known for a while," she continued. "I should have been honest sooner. I'm sorry for that." "What is it you want?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was a prompt, deliberate, neutral, professionally applied. She looked at her tea. "A different kind of life than the one we'd have." He studied her face. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful, in the particular mode of women who understand the mechanics of their own appearance as a professional tool and have optimized accordingly. She was also, he realized, reading off a prepared text. This was not the spontaneous articulation of a feeling. This was a speech that had been refined, probably over weeks, likely in conversation with Claire, possibly during a workout or a long walk, until it contained precisely the minimum of cruelty required to accomplish its goal, while maintaining the speaker's self-image as someone essentially kind. "Who is he?" Ethan said. Her eyes came up. Just a flicker, a small recalibration visible only for a second before the social fluency closed over it again. "That's not what this is," she said. Not a denial. A deflection. He filed it the way he filed everything. Without urgency, without reaction, into the organized space where information waited until he needed it. "All right," he said. He set down his mug. He stood. He had left his jacket on the hook by her door when he arrived. He went and got it. "Ethan." She followed him, and there was something in her voice. Not regret, not quite, but the particular friction of watching someone refuse to perform the emotional response you had prepared for. He had been expected to argue, perhaps, or to plead, or at least to ask more questions, to require more explanation, to make the conversation last longer, in the way of people who needed the ending to earn its weight through duration. He was not going to do that. "Can we talk about this?" she said. "We have," he said. He put on his jacket. "Take care of yourself, Mara." He went down the 4 flights of stairs because her building's elevator had always been slow, and he had learned early in their relationship not to wait for things that could simply be managed another way. Outside, the July air was heavy and warm and smelled like the city's particular summer chemistry, hot pavement and food from somewhere close, and underneath both, something sweet and organic and faintly rotting the way cities rotted when the heat pressed down on them long enough. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He was not destroyed. He had been destroyed once before, at 26, by a different ending, and he knew what destroyed felt like. That specific hollowing, that loss of structural integrity, the sensation of weight without a framework to hold it. This was not that. This was colder and more precise. This was the feeling of a photograph finishing its development. Not the first moment of exposure, but the gradual chemical emergence of forms that had been latent the whole time. He walked to his car, the Acura. He sat in it for a moment without starting the engine and watched the sodium vapor light of the West Village fall across his hands. He had $94,000 in savings. He had a CPA and a CFE, Certified Fraud Examiner, and 3 years of forensic accounting work that had built him a reputation in a very specific, very quiet corner of the financial investigation world. He was not the kind of successful that got photographed on Mediterranean terraces. He was the kind of successful that found things in spreadsheets that other people had specifically tried to make unfindable, and then explained what he found in terms that held up in federal court. He started the car. He drove home. Dominic Ashford became a visible fact of Ethan's life, the way most significant things became visible. Facts in the lives of people who had once been intimate with someone else, through social media, on a Sunday morning, while doing something mundane. He had been reviewing a set of financial statements for a client in New Jersey, a small manufacturing company whose CFO had a gambling problem and had been quietly misappropriating accounts receivable for 14 months, when his phone buzzed. He did not check it immediately. He was in the middle of something, and the middle of something was where he lived most of his waking life. But when he checked the phone 20 minutes later, he found that Mara had posted a photograph. It was a Sunday morning photograph of the kind that required significant preparation to appear spontaneous. She was at a table, outdoor, white cloth, water visible in the background. The light was coastal European. A man's hand was visible at the edge of the frame, resting beside a coffee cup, broad and well-maintained, a watch visible only as a sliver of metal at the wrist with a pronounced tan line above it. The caption, "Some Sundays are better than others." He looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. He noted the setting, the quality of coastal light, the architectural detail visible over her shoulder, the specific gray-green hue of the water. French Riviera, most likely. He noted the hand, he noted the watch. From the proportions of the case, visible even as a sliver, something by Vacheron or Patek, the kind of object worn by men who wanted the people who recognized it to recognize it. He put his phone down and went back to the manufacturing company. But that evening, after he had finished and submitted his preliminary findings and made himself dinner, pasta, olive oil, red pepper flakes, a glass of wine that was better than the apartment he was eating it in, but not by much, he allowed himself to look up Dominic Ashford. It took 4 minutes to get the full shape of him. Ashford Properties, LLC, founded 2012 Seventon. Completed developments in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. A heavy concentration in federally subsidized affordable housing, HUD-insured multifamily projects, low-income housing tax credit developments, mixed-income residential. A profile in the real estate section of the Business Journal from 2021 that described him as a developer with a conscience, and quoted him extensively about his commitment to producing quality housing for communities that needed it most. a LinkedIn maintained with the frequency and strategic intent of a professional brand. A philanthropic arm, the Ashford Community Foundation, with a website featuring photographs of groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, Dominic Ashford standing beside state and city officials with the wide, practiced smile of a man who had learned which muscles to hold. He was 45. He carried his wealth the way certain men carry custom clothing, not for protection or warmth, but as curated signal. His portfolio had a combined estimated value somewhere above $400 million, much of it leveraged, which was standard for development. But the leverage ratios on his two most recent projects had struck Ethan, even in a casual pass, as aggressive in a way that suggested either extraordinary confidence or a financial model that depended on something that hadn't yet become visible. Ethan closed the browser. He washed his dinner dish. He went to bed. He did not think about Dominic Ashford again for almost 2 months. The call from Aldridge and Hartman came in September on a morning that smelled of turned leaves and the first suggestion of cold. It came from a junior partner named Ellis, who explained with careful professional neutrality that the firm had been retained by a group of investors in an entity called Ashford Development Partners 4, a limited partnership vehicle connected to one of Ashford Properties' Newark, New Jersey developments, who believed they had been defrauded. The project had underperformed significantly against projections. The investors had lost a combined $8 million. They believed the offering memoranda and financial statements provided during the solicitation process contained material misrepresentations. Would Ethan be available to conduct a forensic review of the project's financial records? He said he would. He confirmed his rate and his timeline. He arranged a kickoff meeting. He conducted himself throughout the call with the precise neutrality of a professional who had no personal interest in the matter. That evening, he sat in his apartment with a legal pad and wrote at the top, "What do I want here?" He wrote 2 answers. The first, a forensic investigation that is fair, technically accurate, and produces findings I can defend in federal court. The second, which he wrote and then looked at for a long time before leaving it on the page because dishonesty with himself had never served him. To understand, completely and without any remaining ambiguity, exactly what Dominic Ashford built and how he built it. He examined both wants for the conflict between them. He looked carefully and found, with something that was close to satisfaction, that they did not conflict. A rigorous and accurate investigation and a thorough understanding of Dominic Ashford's financial architecture were, in this specific situation, the same pursuit. The fact that he had a personal dimension to the second want did not contaminate the first. He had done enough forensic work to know that the best investigators were the ones who had a reason to want the truth badly enough to sustain the months of tedious, granular, frequently discouraging work that the actual finding of truth required. Detachment was not the same as rigor. Sometimes the motivated investigator found what the professionally neutral one missed. He was not conflicted. He was useful. He started the engagement on a Monday morning. Forensic accounting is not glamorous television. Has always struggled with this because accurate depiction would require extended scenes of spreadsheet analysis occurring in silence over many consecutive hours, generating no visual momentum and providing no suitable backdrop for a score. The reality of Ethan's work was this. He read documents, an extremely large number of documents, in a specific sequence with a specific set of questions running as a low-level current through everything he examined. The questions were always the same. Where did the money originate? Where did it go? Who authorized each movement? Who ultimately benefited? And last, always last, because it could not be constructed until all the others had been answered. What does it look like when you put everything on one page and allow the picture to show itself? For Ashford Development Partners 4, a 186-unit affordable housing development in Newark, financed in part through a HUD-insured mortgage with a final principal amount of $43 million. The document production ran to several thousand pages. Ethan worked through them in a conference room that Aldridge and Hartman had designated for his use, a room with a window facing a building's mechanical equipment and a pod coffee machine that produced something that was technically hot and technically brown and had no other relationship to coffee that he was willing to endorse. He drank it every morning. He had, over 3 years of engagement work, trained himself out of preferences that were inconvenient. The first anomaly appeared on day 6. It lived in the construction cost certification. This was a document required by HUD for all insured multifamily projects. A sworn statement from the developer certifying the actual and final costs of construction submitted as the basis for the calculation of the final insured mortgage amount. The principle was straightforward. Hugh would insure a mortgage up to a percentage of the total project cost, so the certified costs determined the maximum loan. The Newark project's cost certification, filed in November 2020, showed total construction costs of $41 million. Ethan pulled the underlying cost detail and began cross-checking against independently verifiable benchmarks. Regional construction cost indices published by RS Means, publicly available contractor bid data from New Jersey's prevailing wage database, the cost structures from comparable HUD-financed projects in the Mid-Atlantic region that had been filed publicly in annual reports to HUD. The certified costs came in at approximately 28% above the regional benchmark for projects of comparable scope and construction type. 28% above benchmark was not evidence of fraud. Construction costs varied, material prices were volatile, labor markets were regional and project-specific. A competent defense attorney would spend half a day in deposition explaining all the legitimate reasons why a project's certified costs might run above a benchmark without that elevation reflecting any misrepresentation. He knew this. He noted the deviation and kept reading. But he was not looking at a single data point. He was looking at the pattern underneath. He pulled the cost detail further, line by line, category by category, until he reached the section labeled General Conditions and Professional Services, which in a standard construction project encompassed legitimate costs, contractor overhead, site supervision, engineering consultation, project management. On the Newark project, this section included payments totaling $6.2 million, allocated across 4 entities. NJ Construction Consulting, LLC, Metro Site Services, LLC, Keystone Project Management, LLC, Pinnacle Development Group, LLC. He ran the entities through every available database. State contractor licensing registries in New Jersey, New York, and Maryland. The Better Business Bureau. The System for Award Management, which tracked federal contractors. LinkedIn. Google. Legal databases for any public contract filings, court appearances, or regulatory disclosures. All 4 entities returned essentially nothing. No contractor registrations, no active licenses, no websites, no court appearances, no public contracts with any governmental entity, no press coverage of any kind, no employee records, No professional affiliations. He ran the registered agent for all 4 entities through the Delaware Division of Corporations database. The registered agent was Robert Fenwick of Hoboken, New Jersey. He found Robert Fenwick without significant effort. Fenwick was a paralegal at a small law firm in Jersey City that provided incorporation services, one of a category of firms that existed primarily to place authorized signatures on formation documents that other people were responsible for originating and directing. Fenwick had signed formation documents for at least 11 Delaware LLCs over a 4-year period, according to the public registry. From a court filing in an unrelated matter, Ethan found a reference to Fenwick's service fee, $800 per company. Fenwick had, by that calculation, made a total of $8,800 across 11 companies and had, with very high probability, no meaningful understanding of what those companies were being used to accomplish, which meant someone else had originated them. Someone who knew what they needed the companies to do, understood why Delaware was the right jurisdiction to form them in, and had provided Fenwick with the instructions and the fee and the necessary information to produce the paperwork. He kept pulling. He now had 14 LLCs. He had expanded his search to cross-reference the shell company pattern against 5 other Ashford projects using the supplementary production that Aldridge and Hartman had obtained during discovery. 14 entities, 1 registered agent, and a total of approximately $47 million in construction cost payments flowing to companies that had left essentially no verifiable footprint in the actual construction industry. On the morning of day 17, he pulled the payment records that had been produced in discovery and traced the bank account activity for the 4 Newark entities as far as he could through the available documentation. Each of the 4 LLCs had a dedicated bank account. Each account had received a series of wire transfers from the project's construction escrow, timed to align with HUD draw requests that had been certified by the developer as reflecting completed construction milestones. Each account had then, within a period of 30 to 60 days following each deposit, wired its entire balance to a single receiving account. The receiving account was held in the Cayman Islands in the name of an entity called Ashford Holdings International. He sat with that for a long time. The mechanical equipment outside his window made its sound. The pod coffee machine behind him clicked and hissed. The document on his screen did not change. Ashford Holdings International, an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands, the specific jurisdiction that DOJ investigators and HUD's Office of Inspector General had spent decades scrutinizing as a destination for funds removed from the legitimate reach of federal oversight. An entity bearing the name Ashford. Receiving money that had traveled through shell companies, into and through a HUD-insured construction project, originating from a cost certification that a licensed developer had sworn, under penalty of perjury, was accurate. He was not looking at aggressive cost management. He was not looking at a sloppy accounting error that a defense attorney could rationalize as ambiguity. He was looking at a scheme. Specifically, and he had spent enough time in the proximity of False Claims Act litigation to recognize the shape of it. He was looking at a scheme that met the definitional elements of 31 U.S.C. Section 3729 with a precision that was almost methodical. False statements made knowingly or recklessly, submitted to a federal agency, causing the government to pay money it would not otherwise have paid. Carried out across multiple projects over multiple years in a pattern that was not accidental and not ambiguous. He counted the projects again. 7 that he could fully document. Possibly more. He thought about $60 to $90 million over 4 years, routed through 14 shell companies and a Cayman offshore account. He went home that evening and sat in his apartment for 2 hours in the dark. He understood the False Claims Act the way he understood most things he needed for his work, not academically, not from a textbook, but from the inside of cases. He had been retained as a forensic consultant on 2 prior qui tam matters, both brought by other relators, and had provided the financial analysis that supported the government's damages calculations. He knew the statute's structure. The qui tam provision, qui tam pro domino rege quam pro se ipso in hac parte sequitur, the full Latin construction translating to something like, "He who sues in this matter for the king as well as for himself," allowed a private citizen who discovered evidence of fraud against the federal government to file a complaint under seal with the DOJ. The filing was not public. The government then had 60 days, extendable and frequently extended, to investigate and determine whether to intervene. If the government chose to intervene, and the case resolved in the government's favor through settlement, judgment, or criminal forfeiture, the person who had brought the complaint, called the relator, received a statutory share of the recovery. Under 31 U.S.C. Section 3730D, that share ranged from 15 to 30%, depending on the extent of the relator's contribution to the prosecution. He sat with the arithmetic. 7 projects. If the inflated cost certifications on those 7 projects had resulted in HUD-insured mortgages that exceeded the legitimate costs by even a conservative estimate of $10 million per project, the government's total damages, tripled as the statute provided, since the False Claims Act imposed mandatory treble damages, could reach $200 million or more. His relator share at 15% would be $30 million. At 25%, $50 million. He held the arithmetic in his head, and then, with the specific discipline he had spent years developing, he set it down. He set it down because the arithmetic was not the reason, and if he allowed the arithmetic to become the reason, he would lose the most important thing, the clean, legally defensible factual record of a forensic accountant who had found evidence of fraud and had reported it because that was what the evidence warranted and what the law provided for. The arithmetic was a consequence. The reason was the document on his screen. He called Patricia Wynn the following Monday. Patricia Wynn worked out of a D.C. office that was aggressively underfurnished for the amount of money it processed. Metal shelves, a whiteboard with things written on it in multiple colors that had never been erased, 2 chairs facing her desk that were functional, and nothing beyond. She had spent 15 years bringing False Claims Act cases, with a win rate that was among the top in the country and a reputation in the DOJ's civil division that was built on the quality of the evidentiary packages she submitted rather than on any particular personal warmth. She was not warm. She was precise. She asked good questions, listened to the answers without performing the listening, and moved through legal analysis with the efficiency of someone who had done it enough times to have dispensed with everything that was not essential. She reviewed his materials over a weekend. On Monday, she called. "The EIN connection is your cleanest nexus to Ashford personally," she said. "The offshore routing is circumstantial until we have bank records, but the government has the tools to compel those. Your forensic methodology, I'm going to need to review your working papers, but based on what you've sent, it reads as defensible." "I can defend every number in federal court," he said. "Your engagement with Aldridge and Hartman was legitimate. You were retained for a proper purpose. You found this in the ordinary course of that engagement. You are not a competing developer. You are not a disgruntled former employee with an axe. You're a forensic accountant who found evidence of federal fraud while conducting a properly authorized investigation, and who is reporting it through the legally prescribed channel. That's accurate. There will be a public component eventually. When the government intervenes, the seal lifts. His attorneys will immediately work to identify you. I know. She was quiet for a moment, then, "How do you feel about that?" He thought about it longer than she probably expected. "I think it's appropriate," he said. "I found something that was being systematically hidden from people who had a legal right to know it existed. The fact that my name gets attached to having found it seems like the natural result of doing the right thing with the right information." A sound that was adjacent to a laugh, but chose not to commit to the full form. "I'll prepare the complaint," she said. 3 weeks, if you can get me the complete documentation package by end of this week." He could get it to her by Thursday. He filed on a Tuesday. He had not specifically chosen Tuesday. It was simply the day when everything was ready, when the documentation package was complete, when Patricia Wynne had the complaint in its final form, when the couriers were available to file at the D.C. District Court in the early morning before the Civil Division's intake closed. But when he realized, after the fact, that he had done it on a Tuesday, he had allowed himself a moment of appreciation for the coincidence. Tuesdays, apparently, were when things changed. The months between filing and intervention were, in their surface texture, unremarkable. He finished the Aldridge and Hartman engagement and delivered his forensic report. Precise, comprehensive, legally defensible, documenting the losses suffered by the limited partnership investors and the specific financial misrepresentations that had caused them. He took 2 other cases. He upgraded apartments, not as a statement, but as the practical consequence of a water heater failing, a landlord negotiating badly, and a month of free utilities that he redirected into a security deposit on a place with south-facing windows and afternoon light that moved through the rooms in a way he had not had in any apartment he'd previously occupied. He did not look at Mara Sinclair's social media. He did not look at Dominic Ashford's coverage in the real estate trades. He did not monitor the Business Journal for updates on Ashford Properties' active projects. Not because he was incurious, but because he had already looked at everything he needed to look at, and looking again would have been a kind of anxious repetition that was not in his character. He ran. He cooked. He read technical literature in the evenings, not because he had to, but because the particular pleasure of understanding something difficult in its complete detail was one of the few pleasures he had never had to rationalize. He did not date. Not from grief. The grief, such as it was, had completed its work early in the apartment building stairwell in the West Village on a July evening, and had not lingered. He didn't date because the amount of energy required to begin something new, to explain himself to a new person, to build the vocabulary that 2 people needed to actually talk to each other, felt, in this period, like energy he would rather put elsewhere. Later, maybe. Later had always been available. Sophie Lynn, who had known him for 6 years and had the specific acuity of a forensic professional who applied her analytical habits to people as readily as to documents, called him in November to ask if he was dead. "I haven't heard from you in 2 months, she said. "I've been working," he said. "Ethan, you've always been working. You've also historically sent emails." He told her, in broad terms and without specific detail, what he had been doing. He told her there was a matter involving federal fraud allegations, and that it was in an advanced stage of development, and that he wasn't in a position to discuss the specifics. He told her the work was going well. Sophie listened carefully, and then said, "This wouldn't have anything to do with Ashford properties, would it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I'm also in forensic consulting, and I read the same journals you do. And 3 weeks ago, there was a short item in the Litigation Finance Journal about an uptick in Kwai Tam filings in the federal housing space. And I did the math on your timeline and your new apartment, and you know I'm good at math." He said, "I can't discuss an ongoing matter." She said, "I know. I'll see you when it breaks." Patricia Wynne called him on a Thursday in December to confirm what she had been expecting. The government had decided to intervene. The Civil Division of the DOJ, in coordination with HUD's Office of Inspector General and a field office of the FBI, had concluded their preliminary review and found the evidentiary foundation sufficient to proceed. The complaint would unseal on Tuesday. "Is that going to be a problem for you?" she asked. "No," he said. "Tuesday works." He went into Aldridge and Hartman on Tuesday morning. He sat in the conference room on the 34th floor. He watched Richard Hartman read 43 pages. He answered questions. He left. He walked north on 6th Avenue in the December that had not yet decided about snow. He was standing on the sidewalk outside the building, not moving, when his phone buzzed. "Sophie, it's up. Business Journal just posted. You okay?" He sent back, "Yes, working." He went to his office and worked for 4 hours. Then he read the article. The headline, "Ashford Properties Developer Faces Federal Fraud Allegations in HUD Loan Scheme." 1,200 words. The relator described as a forensic accounting professional with direct access to the company's financial records. The DOJ and HUDOIG cited. Patricia Wynne's office quoted briefly and with appropriate restraint. Dominic Ashford's attorney, the allegations were without merit and would be vigorously contested. Ethan read that statement twice. Without merit. The statement of an attorney who had not yet seen the EIN application with the partial Social Security number, or the bank records that the DOJ had by now compelled, or the 14 LLCs, or the 43 pages. He closed the browser and went back to work. Mara called at 4:17 that afternoon. He watched her name on the screen and experienced not surprise, but the particular arrival of something he had theoretically anticipated in its actual physical form: sound, light, the vibration of his phone against his desk. He let it go to voicemail. She called again at 4:41. He let that one go, too. The third call at 5:06 also went to voicemail, and this time she left a message. He listened to it that evening, after dinner, in the south-facing apartment with the December light long gone, and the city showing itself in its evening illumination through the windows. Her voice was controlled. She had rehearsed this or something close to it. At the edges, where rehearsal ran out, the control thinned into a register that was higher and more exposed than the words she was using. "Ethan, it's Mara." A pause. "I don't know if you're following the news today, but I think you probably are. I don't know what I wanted. I wanted to talk to someone. I know that's a lot to ask. I'm sorry for that." Another pause, longer. "Call me if you want to. You don't have to." He sat with the phone in his hand. He thought about the voice. He thought about what the voice was doing and what it was asking for, and what, underneath the asking, it believed it was entitled to. He set the phone down on the table. He picked up his wine. The asset freeze came 2 days later. A federal court granted the government's application to freeze Dominic Ashford's domestic assets pending the full proceedings. The accounts of Ashford Properties LLC, 3 specifically named development LLCs, and Ashford's personal accounts, insofar as they were traceable to the fraudulent scheme. The Cayman account was subject to international cooperation requests that would take longer and carried more uncertainty, but the domestic freeze was comprehensive and immediate, in concrete terms. The apartment Mara was living in, which was held by Ashford Properties LLC as an executive residence, a detail that had appeared in the corporate structure documents produced during discovery, which Ethan had noted and set aside and not thought about further because it was not his job to think about it further, was now unreachable. The credit accounts connected to those entities were declined when presented. The financing on Ashford's 2 active development projects evaporated, since no institutional lender continued a credit facility to an entity under active federal fraud investigation, and the general contractors on both projects suspended work pending payment clarification. 3 employees of Ashford Properties LLC were terminated within 72 hours of the freeze. There was no accessible payroll account from which to pay them. The Business Journal ran a follow-up story, then another. The real estate trades picked it up. A local television station in Newark ran a segment that included footage of the stalled construction site, the rusting crane frozen mid-arc, the plywood hoardings on which an Ashford Properties rendering of a completed building had been posted and then defaced, partially by weather. Ethan knew these details because Patricia Wynne kept him appropriately informed, because the financial press was covering it with increasing specificity, and because Sophie sent him the Newark crane photograph with a text that said only, "The rendering is still up." He looked at it for a moment, the artist's rendering of the finished building, all clean angles and natural light, and figures in the foreground arranged to suggest community, still posted on the hoarding of a stalled site. And then set his phone down. Sophie chose a restaurant in the West Village for their lunch in the second week of December. In a narrow room that smelled of wood smoke and warm food, and had the settled quality of a place that had been operating long, enough to develop its own particular gravity. He suspected she had chosen the neighborhood deliberately. He did not bring it up. He ordered soup. It was December, and the city outside was the color of concrete, and soup was the correct decision. "How are you, actually?" she said. It was not a soft question in her delivery. "Better than I expected," he said. "I think I've been in motion for so long on this that the landing is quieter than the approach." "There's going to be a criminal referral," she said. Not as gossip, as information she had, and believed he deserved. "My firm is hearing that the FBI has been building a parallel criminal investigation. Wire fraud, bank fraud. If they convene a grand jury, they will." She looked at him without editorializing. "And her?" He held the question for a moment before he answered it. "I don't know what she knew. There's no evidence she was involved in the scheme. She may have had no substantive understanding of how Dominic Ashford's business actually operated. But she chose his world. She chose the surface of it," Ethan said. "She chose what was visible from the outside, which was built on something that wasn't real. I don't blame her for not being able to see through a fraudulent financial structure that I found by spending 4 months reading the documentation from the inside." He looked at his soup. "I'm not sitting here counting her losses. That's not what this was." Sophie was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of someone who is deciding whether to say the next thing. "Then what was it?" she said. "It was the right thing to do," with information I had. He looked up at her. 7 communities got the minimum, instead of what a federal housing program was designed to provide, because the man developing their buildings was siphoning the budget into a Cayman account. Robert Fenwick, the paralegal who signed 11 LLCs for $800 each, and went home to Hoboken not knowing what he'd put his name to, deserved not to spend the rest of his working life inadvertently facilitating federal fraud. The investors in the limited partnership, who were told their money was going into a legitimate development and lost $8 million, they deserved to have what happened to them named accurately. He paused. The fact that the man at the center of all of it happened to be the man Mara left me for is a fact. It's not nothing, but it's a detail. Sophie picked up her fork. She looked at him for a moment with the expression she used when she had assessed something and arrived at a conclusion she was comfortable with. "You know what I think you are," she said. "What?" "The most predictable man I know," she said, "in the best possible way." He looked at her. She held it without deflection. Then he picked up his spoon and finished the soup. The criminal indictment came on a Wednesday in February. 8 counts. 3 of wire fraud, 2 of bank fraud, 1 of conspiracy to defraud the United States, 2 of making false statements to a federal agency. Patricia Wynne called him at 9 in the morning. She was brief, as she always was with good news. Good news required less explanation than complications did. 8 counts, she said. The conspiracy count alone carries 5 years. The wire fraud counts are 20 each. His attorney will move to negotiate, but the documentary record is what it is. "Thank you, Patricia." "Thank yourself," she said. "You built the evidentiary foundation. We just delivered it to the right address." The Business Journal ran the indictment story that afternoon with a photograph of Dominic Ashford on the courthouse steps in February light. He was flanked by 2 attorneys. He was wearing a suit, still a custom suit, because wardrobes were the last thing to go, and the specific armor of expensive clothes was harder to remove than the finances that had paid for it. His face was doing the specific work of a man who has prepared for this exact moment and is executing the preparation as competently as the preparation allows. Ethan looked at the photograph for a moment. The jaw, the suit, the prepared face. Then he closed the browser. She came in person on a Friday evening in March, and he came down because he had considered the possibility of this visit more than once, and had made his decision about it already, in the clarity of a long time thinking about things without the distortion of urgency. The lobby of his building was clean and adequately lit, and smelled of nothing particular. None of the recycled cologne or institutional coffee of other lobbies, just neutrality. She was standing near the entrance in a dark charcoal coat he had not seen before. Good quality, but a register lower than what she had been wearing in the visible months of her life with Dominic Ashford. She looked not diminished. Mara Sinclair was not the kind of person who did diminished, but something in her presentation had been stripped back to a layer closer to the actual. The performance had thinned, and what showed through was her face in a more direct form than he was used to seeing. He stopped 6 feet from her. "You look well," she said. "I am," he said. She looked around the lobby briefly, not assessing it, but gathering herself through the act of having somewhere neutral to look. "Can we find somewhere to talk?" "Here is fine," he said. She took that in. "Okay." She met his eyes and held them in a way that was different from the social fluency she usually deployed for eye contact, more effortful, less polished. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I understand the decisions I made." He said nothing. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 3 months," she said. "Every version sounds either like I'm asking for something or like I'm explaining myself, and I don't want to do either of those things." "Then don't," he said. She looked at him with something he had not seen on her face before. Not in the West Village apartment on the Tuesday with the tea. Not in the photographs he had occasionally seen in the months of her visible life in Ashford's world. Not in any of the 3 years he had held her coffee order and remembered her mother's birthday. Something underneath the surface layer of social capability, asking something that was not a question and not a request. Just a thing that needed to be said out loud by someone. To someone. "I told Claire you weren't enough," she said. "At her party. On the roof. I know you heard it. I figured that out, eventually, looking back at when things started to change in you. Or not change. Maybe I just started seeing what had always been there." He said nothing. "I was wrong," she said. Not just in the obvious way that everyone would say I was wrong now, with the benefit of outcome. In the actual way. I was measuring you against a metric that wasn't real, and I didn't see it, and then I went and built my life around the thing I thought was more real, and it wasn't real at all." She stopped. "That's not something I'm saying to you as accusation, or as, I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it because it's the truest thing I have right now, and I've been carrying it." The lobby was quiet. The front desk attendant was occupied behind his screen. Outside through the glass doors, the March evening was gray and wet, the city in that specific late winter state of being beautiful in a way that required you to accept its grayness as part of the deal. Ethan looked at her face. He thought about the rooftop. He thought about the 43 pages. He thought about Robert Fenwick in Hoboken, and the 7 communities, and a filing on a Tuesday morning in a building she had walked past every day. He thought about what he wanted to say. He found, when he looked for it honestly, in the way he had trained himself to look at things honestly, that what he wanted to say was almost nothing. Not because he was empty, and not because there was nothing true and complex and worth articulating about what the last 2 years had meant, or built, or left behind, but because almost everything he had to say about it existed in a form that was his, belonged to him, the same way the work had always been his. The calculation, the patience, the specific cold discipline of building something carefully in the dark and saying nothing until it was done. He had not done it for an audience. He had not done it to produce a moment like this one. He had done it because it was the work that was in front of him, and the work had turned out to be the thing. He was not going to hand that over. "Get a lawyer who handles asset forfeiture," he said. "If you were living in an Ashford Properties asset when the freeze was executed, you may have civil disclosure obligations depending on how your tenancy was structured. Someone who knows federal civil forfeiture procedure." She blinked. Once, twice. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed again. "That's what I've got for you, Mara." He turned and walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. The elevator, in this building, was faster than her old buildings had ever been. He heard her not say anything. He stood with his back to the lobby and his eyes on the brushed metal doors. They opened. He stepped in. He pressed 31. The doors closed. In the distorted surface of the metal, his reflection looked back at him. Slightly elongated, the face of a man who had been called, in a specific and well-attended social context, the most predictable man a woman had ever been with, and who had spent the subsequent 18 months proving that the predictability they had seen was not a ceiling. His phone buzzed. He took it out. Patricia Wynne. Government recovery estimate revised upward to approximately $90 million across 7 confirmed projects. Relator share calculation proceeding. Expect our office to contact you early, next week, with preliminary figures. He read it once. He put the phone in his pocket. The elevator rose, and the door opened onto the 31st floor, and the hallway was quiet, and the door to his apartment was where it had always been. Behind it, the south-facing windows held the last of the March light, thin and cold and working its way through the grayness with the specific persistence of things that do not need to announce themselves to be real. He went inside.
We have lost the sector. Move to defensive positions.
It's kind of funny to think about that, because, like, I wonder, now that, like, I'm a parent, I wonder what albums or music is going to do that for my kid. My social existence is live music, still is, and I'm 52. I got to see bands at least weekly. That's sick. I haven't been to a show in I don't know how long. It's been a couple of years. I think the last one I went to was when I was I've been moving in so slow. It was like 2018, I think, was the last show I went to. It's a band called, it was This Wild Life and then Dry Jacket. And it was pretty sick. I was a little, I lived near